preferences? I don't care.
Alexis, why don't you come?
Sure.
Yeah, and then.
Good. Hi, welcome to Park Avenue Armory. I am Heather Lubov. I'm the Chief Development Officer at the Armory. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to our stunning Board of Officers room, which just opened last week after an extensive restoration. I do think this is truly one of the most beautiful rooms in New York, thanks to our brilliant architects, Herzog and Demeron. I would also like to say a very warm welcome to all of you who are tuning in to our very first live stream. And you are all encouraged to tweet your thoughts and questions using the handle hashtag MAVAC. We took over the lease to the building 6 years ago with a mission to restore our landmark spaces as a center for immersive and unconventional art. Massive Attack versus Adam Curtis is a perfect example of the work that we do, giving two extremely talented artists the ability to dream big, to be provocative, and to quite literally, if you haven't seen the show yet, surround the audience with their art. Thanks to the British Council, which has been an incredibly generous funder of the show, as well as the sponsor of the series of talks related to the work, we have a fantastic panel assembled tonight to discuss one of the major issues that Adam Curtis considers in his work, the role of the media. So it is with great pleasure, it is my great pleasure to thank and to introduce Graham Sheffield, the Director of Arts for the British Council, who will moderate tonight's panel. Graham is responsible for the Council's global arts policy. He's had a long and distinguished career in the arts, including 15 years as the Artistic Director of London's Barbican Centre, which is Europe's largest multi-arts centre. We feel a particular kinship with the Barbican because, like the Armory, it programs in all artistic forms, music, theater, dance, film, spoken word, and the visual arts, and places a very strong emphasis on artistic partnerships and on arts education. Graham also served as the CEO of the West Kowloon Cultural District Authority in Hong Kong, where he led the development of one of the largest arts infrastructures and programming projects ever envisioned. So I will turn things over to Graham.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. And I should say, actually, it's interesting you made the reference to the Barbican is that Alex Poots, who's your programmer here, or your director here, worked for me when I was at the South Bank, actually, in the 90s. Some of you may know the Festival Meltdown, which is still going after 20-odd years. Yeah. I started that in 93, and Alex came and helped program in 94. And then when we did a festival on the US in the Barbican in 98, Alex was our consultant. So we've been working together for like 20 years. So I'm sorry he's not here tonight, but he may be tucked under the duvet in Manchester watching this on a live stream. So hello, Alex. I think several people have said they're going to be watching this tonight. So welcome to all of you, whether you're in the US, UK, or other parts of the world. I think maybe there's one colleague watching from Syria, though it's quite late. From Lebanon, actually. She is Syrian, but from the Middle East. It's great to think that this discussion will resonate further than this room. I've certainly always been drawn to works of art which comment on and reflect and challenge contemporary and recent history and politics. And as such, this piece, which I saw in Manchester, is a fantastically bold and innovative example, typical of the challenging and the risky artistic policy that Alex chooses to follow in his festival direction, both in Manchester as well as here. And I'm assuming everybody here has either seen it or will see it tonight, so I won't be revealing, as it were, the end of the Agatha Christie storyline if I say it's a very, very provocative and challenging take on world history, post-war through to 2005 Iraq. Unless it's changed since I saw it in Manchester, give or take a few years in either direction. It's almost the history of my history, in a sense. So a lot of the images I was seeing, I remember from my childhood, not the very, very earliest ones. So in very, very contemporary, intense visual experience, and the music formed by Robert Del Nayo of Massive Attack and the provocative filmmaking. Now, the theme for the panel tonight is not specifically artistic, not a critique of the show as such, but we've called it Viewing Media Through an Artistic Lens - the Power of Illusion and the Illusion of Power. But hopefully we're going to cast some light on the show and its purpose from philosophical angle, a political angle, economic and journalistic. And joining me to explore the topic, a fantastically distinguished trio of thinkers. On my left, Alexis Goldstein, activist, self-described as activist, writer, programmer, teacher, and occupier. A contributor at The Nation, frequent media guest on MSNBC's Up with Chris Hayes, and she tells me recently joined an organization called the Other 98%. Maybe you'll bring that into the discussion at some point, encouraging public democracy. On the far right, Simon Critchley, philosopher and presenter of an excellent series of talks at Brooklyn Academy of Music, self-confessedly as a philosopher, quote, interested in everything. And Joyce Barnathan, president of the International Center for Journalists, a not-for-profit for the advancement of quality journalism worldwide. And goodness knows we need it, I think. It's very much needed, I would have thought, particularly in the UK, actually, at the moment. I must say I found it an extraordinary show, particularly as I'm a musician, of overlay of the ironic and contemporary popular music of the period, even finding bits of Peter Grimes, Britain's Peter Grimes, stuck in there. It's quite hard to unpick sometimes some of the decision-making, some of the hectoring tone of the piece, the villains all exposed. But whatever you think of it or thought of it, it is a virtuoso piece of filmmaking with a brilliant cross-cutting and editing, and the whole creative process is fascinating in itself. So let's start with the immediate reactions to the work from the audience, as it were, the panelists who've seen the work in the last few days. Just give us your headline thoughts on how it was for you. That's the best way to start, and then we'll get to everybody in the discussion. And we will have opportunities for Q&A at the end, so please store up your provocative and challenging questions for the panel, and we'll have 20 minutes at the end to catch those. So who wants to start? Alexis, you're looking bursting to go.
Sure. Can I just see who has seen the piece already? Okay, about half of you.
Half.
So I found it very visceral. I think that what I appreciated about it is it seemed a political piece with sort of an overarching message, but it was also deeply personal, and it was trying to manipulate our emotions, I felt, because there were a lot of individual characters that we were sort of introduced to and got to know, and it explored a lot of different themes, from sort of like our obsession with the 24-hour news cycle to the fetishization of finance and data and the sort of pitfalls and challenges and really chaos that has come in the wake of it. But what I found moving was the sort of interplay between the sort of pounding music and the lights. Like in particular, there's one moment that I remember, and I don't think this unveils anything for those of you who haven't seen it, where there's gunfire and there's a scene of war and the lights are firing in rapid succession, so as we feel as if we are being ourselves attacked. And there are moments where it's talking about all of us becoming more withdrawn into ourselves, and the visions and the visuals of the piece are very dark. And the music is very dark. And so it's this sort of participatory experience. We're looking at this narration of what the world has become and the sort of cynicism and the darkness that the world has become, but we are brought along, I felt, in that journey and made to feel emotionally the same thing that we're sort of being told the world itself has become. And so that was what I thought was most moving about it.
Did you concentrate on the message or the art?
I found them fairly indistinguishable. I suppose if I had to pick one, I was focused more on the message. But
I found it to be a fascinating work of art. I myself had never experienced anything like this, and when I tried to explain what it was to people, as a journalist, I'm usually have words to explain it, and I just couldn't put my finger on one thing that it was. It was sort of a documentary, it was sort of a concert, it was sort of a visual arts show. I mean, it was a lot of things, and you know, obviously there was some very strong and interesting storytelling in this thing. So for me, the fact that I was puzzled and struggling to figure it out was actually an exciting thing, because I felt this was a new experience for me as a viewer, a new form of entertainment that was also illuminating. I didn't necessarily agree with the storyline. As a journalist, I didn't see it. You notice I did not say this is a work of journalism. I didn't see it as a work of journalism, even though I know the creator may see himself as a journalist. But I did think it was an exciting experience as a participant and a lover of the arts.
Yeah, I mean, I really liked it. I'm here as the Massive Attack fan. I mean, I grew up listening to, well, a bit more than grew up listening to Massive Attack, and I don't know how familiar people here and elsewhere are with the Massive Attack phenomenon and what that means. We could talk about that. But, and they've got Horace Andy, who is a legend for people like me, Jamaican reggae singer, and Liz Fraser, who was the lead singer in Cocteau Twins, and that sort of stuff. And then, I mean, for the bass sound alone, it's worth being in the room. The sound quality is extraordinary. That's United Visual Arts. So the sound is a kind of immersive totality, and it really is beautiful because it's incredibly loud, but there's no distortion. So, and then the screens are, I mean, there's multiple screen effect is terrific. It's there are things that it reminds me of a little bit of the pieces by like artists like Mark Leckey, British artist, like Fiorucci Made Me Hardcore, which used popular music and footage like that. But this is also more kind of didactic. There's a story. If you know Adam Curtis's, I guess if you're going to know anything by him, it would be A Century of the Self, which is an extraordinary account of the emergence of the self out of propaganda through the medium of Freud's nephew. It's an extraordinary, and it's a very particular and didactic history. And this is a very particular and didactic history I see as the shift from, I guess, a kind of post-war world, Cold War world, which was premised upon some idea that there could be change, that individuals could change the world, and that was a good thing, to a vision of what he calls repeatedly a managed world or a static world, which is where we find ourselves today. And the kind of linchpin in that narrative is Chernobyl and the image of the sarcophagus. So it's a kind of very personal take on the last 50, 60 years of Western history, let's say. And it goes in a very kind of dystopian direction. And then you come up with a nice conclusion at the end that I won't spoil for people, but I'm not sure whether I buy it.
But it tells us a very good encapsulation of it. It tells us a lot about Adam Curtis himself and his views, but does it tell us anything about the power of the art, in the sense that, is he saying there's nothing we can do about it, or there's nothing that that work can do to make us learn lessons from what we've done? Is there a sense of, even though the ending tries to be optimistic, is it in a sense a false optimism?
It was a very peculiar kind of, I'd like other people to, to get a sense of this. There's a very peculiar kind of irony, in the piece, that it's all about the development of a world which is 24/7 CNN news coverage, as it were, a world of endless two-dimensional images that will not go away and will not die. And we stand for 90 minutes watching images of that world, immersed in a kind of nostalgic world, which is the world of Massive Attack in the 1990s. So I don't know. I mean, there was an extraordinary moment in the narrative, which is where he talks about the Taliban, and about Taliban iconoclasm, Because one response to, as it were, a world of images is to just to forbid images, destroy them.
Well, and that's and without, I suppose, unveiling it for those of you who haven't seen it, that was a particularly moving piece because they essentially show that the Taliban aim to erase all imagery and then make a very compelling case for the fact that they were actually very much influenced by the imagery of the American mass media and the apparatus of Hollywood. And they sort of present that in a way that is, I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but it's very, very moving and very powerful.
Yeah. And that's true, you know. I mean, it's, you know, I remember reading Osama bin Laden's statement, "The Towers of Lebanon," where he talks. It's the one where he talks about the motivation for the 9/11 attacks, and the motivation for the 9/11 attacks was a visual memory that he had of the attacks on the towers of Beirut from 1982. So, as it were, 9/11 begins as a visual memory, and you know, we tend to forget. There's a lot more we could say about that, about the power of it, the strange power of it. So I'm not sure whether we're shown a way out.
Well, that's, oh, go on.
Sorry, I was just going to say, like, I agree with you because you sort of wonder if we're being punked by the end because there's so much emphasis throughout the piece about you can be fooled by things that are not real, and we present these illusions, and then they become reality. And he gives the example of Donald Rumsfeld at Meet the Press and talking about how Osama bin Laden is hiding inside of this giant, enormous underground fortress, and there's dozens of them just like this. Yeah. And then in the end, you know, it's very clear that we have been fooled by this illusion, and yet we have and there's no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq either, and we're being fooled by the illusion. So to what extent is the audience meant to be aware of the idea that maybe we're being fooled by an illusion as we sit here and watch the piece, or not?
Yes, I mean, I found it in some senses quite nihilistic in the sense that you know, you're not left with any solutions, any better ways out. He's excoriated virtually everything from the extreme right to the extreme left.
And he's never actually said what that ideal world is. He's just shown us how we failed over the last 50. But, you know, that said, you know, it's kind of interesting that, you know, I could see he had several couples that he picked out, and one of them was, you know, Ted Turner and Jane Fonda. And you can see the example of Jane Fonda, who was the great change the world, fight the Vietnam War, and then she's, you know, Miss Body Beautiful doing her calisthenics. But Ted Turner, you know, Ted Turner created CNN. Of course, you know, I'm the journalist here speaking. But, and I'm sitting there thinking, what was wrong with the creation of a 24/7 news channel? What was the heresy in this? Did he feel that the images just got cheapened because they were commoditized, or what? You know, one of the interesting things as a journalist, I mentioned this to you earlier, was that I covered the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, which is shown as one of the great failings of the era, and I will tell you that this accident happened. I mean, I know it vividly. I know the day. I know when it happened. It happened on a Saturday, April 26, 1986. And I was the Moscow bureau chief of Newsweek at the time. We did not know till 3 or 4 days later that there actually had been an accident. You know, we were aware over the weekend that radiation had been flowing somewhere. They were capturing it, and they thought it was Sweden. And Sweden shut down its nuclear power plants, and then they said, no, it's coming from, you know, the direction I was sitting in. And it was like, oh my God. And I remember when my bosses called me on a Tuesday and said to me, we're doing a cover story. And I said, oh, okay, on what? I said, on the worst nuclear accident in history. Now imagine that now. I mean, is this progress? That they could hide, people could hide things of that magnitude in that era to us, and we were just shut out of the news. So I'm wondering whether his premise about technology, data, sending of information is actually that horrible a thing. I mean, look at Assad now in Syria. His father leveled a whole freaking town in Syria, Hama, and nobody could see it, and nobody did anything about it. And now look what his son has done with poison gas, and the whole world is on him. And we have evidence, we have pictures, we have citizen journalism, we have a lot of, so I struggled with a lot of his vision of the world today, and I guess I'm more optimistic.
Yes, it's not exactly nuanced, the vision, is it?
No, that's why it's not journalistic. It's not even, there's no other side. It's just, he's got a vision of how dark this world is, and he does a very good job of using multimedia to get it across. But I have to say that, you know, maybe others identify, and it wasn't that there weren't things that resonated with me that he said, but it wouldn't exactly be, if I were going to write the story, that would be the way I would see the world.
Well, I think one of the things that I got out of what he was trying to say about the mass media and the constant cycle was that we are sort of observers now. We're spectators. We aren't active participants in our own lives with agency. It's this idea that we're being inundated with data at all times, and it allows us to withdraw into our sarcophagus, which is one of the central themes that keeps coming up. And I actually don't have an answer. I'm curious what the rest of you think, but of how to unpack this, because it starts with Chernobyl fairly early on. Chernobyl is itself a sarcophagus, and then later on in the piece it talks about how we have all become this sort of self-contained sarcophagus. And there's a lot of people that he identifies throughout the piece who also withdraw into themselves. There's the scientist who won't leave his hotel room in Reno. There's the daughter of Pauline Botti, thank you, who eventually dies of a heroin overdose and is sort of withdrawn into herself. And so there's this like recurring theme of the sarcophagus, and I'm still trying to figure out how to unpack how, you know, Chernobyl, here's this accident that sort of presses outward versus the sarcophagus that pulls inward while we sit and just watch reality.
We sit and watch reality, and we take drugs to affect our moods. There's a little interview with a kid with ADD or whatever, and the proliferation of the pathologies of the sarcophagus, as it were, and the drug treatments that go along with it.
It's interesting you mentioned the Chernobyl and the sarcophagus, and the fact that if they'd still been making this film, they could have sort of reeled in Japan and the whole Fukushima nuclear plant, which is all happening all over again. But Simon, you had a sort of mini treatise you wanted to deliver on the sort of sarcophagus and the kind of
what is a sarcophagus?
What is a sarcophagus, and how do you unpick that? Yeah.
Well, because you could think of a sarcophagus as somewhere you put dead people, but it's not true, because in Egyptian sarcophagi, this was a passage to the afterlife. Life didn't end; it continued in some other form. So the sarcophagus is not a place for the dead, it's the place for the kind of undead. And the sarcophagus of Chernobyl is certainly not dead. The nuclear gunk in there lives and will live for however long that will live. And then the sarcophagus of data within which the prisons that we build for ourselves with our phones and the rest of the apparatus that we use are also not going to die, right?
Well, and there's that recurring theme
you can drop dead tonight and your Facebook page will still be up and running.
That celebrities never die. We're watching dead people dance over and over and over again, and there's that sort of long montage of people who are no longer with us dancing.
So we live in this sort of ghost world, right? And the film is a kind of almost, ghostly nostalgia at times for the ways in which we're inhabited by the past.
It's almost an afterlife in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's something, I might be the only person here who believes in ghosts, because, I believe in theatre, and theatre is all about ghosts. Hamlet, Aeschylus's The Persians, and it's all about, and ghosts are those creatures that refuse to obey the line between life and death. And that can seem like a supernatural thought, but it can also seem like we are in an odd situation that we're flooded. We flood ourselves with data that won't die, and not just data, metadata that won't die. and so, yeah.
Did the music? You guys know the music very well. Did the music have that same intellectual component there? Was there a selection of the pieces that fit the narrative that he was saying?
Well, that's what I was going to actually read my mind. I don't think we haven't met before, but I was just going to say, we're talking about the documentary aspects and historical, but we're not talking so much other than about the music. And I don't know, I've got a view on it. I found it overwhelming as an experience, but I'm not sure, I found the music in many ways quite nostalgic, as opposed to the kind of the rigor of the intellectual debate in the film. How does that?
Well, I mean, it is, it's music from the past. I mean, the most powerful moment, I think, is when Horace Andy, again, this giant of, Jamaican reggae, does Sugar Sugar, the most kind of inconsequential of songs, over footage from a British show called the Black and White Minstrel Show, which you can guess what it was from the title. It was an unpleasant kind of. But we grew up watching it, and it was perfectly normal that white people would have blackface and dance around on television. So you've got that strange juxtaposition. So there's a kind of the way in which things like, I don't know, you can reel them off. The Shirelles, Dusty Springfield, all sorts of songs are used. And then there's a kind of chronological sequence. Well, there's one Massive Attack moment, which is the track 2 of Protection, the 1994 album, is called Karma Coma, which is with tricky speaking. And I guess there's a kind of point that's being made about being comatose. We're in a kind of karma coma. That's what it's like in the sarcophagus of data. But the most powerful musical moment was if any Bauhaus fans out there, there's an extraordinary moment when Bela Lugosi is dead appears, and just the opening chords of it, oh God, it's Bela Lugosi is dead. So there is that nostalgia, and I don't know quite what to do with it. You could say it's a ghostly nostalgia, it's twisted, but it is a kind of, there is a temptation to wallow.
Yeah. That's what I felt, but I'd be interested to keep the discussion going afterwards on that, because I'm trying to convince myself that it could work without the music, just as a piece of documentary journalism.
And one thing about the music is that Massive Attack, why Massive Attack so hugely important in the history of British music, is that they appear in Bristol in the early 90s, 91, Blue Line's the first CD, but they're coming out of the 80s scene. Bristol's a complex cultural nexus of all sorts of things, strong influences from the Caribbean, all of that. So you've got a musical form which is hugely indebted to Black American music, particularly to reggae, and then to punk and post-punk and all that stuff. As a kind of mix. The point being, we were talking about this before, is that Massive Attack were something new, right? Music hadn't sounded like that before, and it was extraordinary. So there's a kind of way in which the question that we're asked at the end of the piece, which is, go home and do something. You think, okay, I'm going to go home on the subway and do, but in a sense, is answered musically. In a sense, music is a strange thing where you can take a whole assemblage of traditions and different forms, and at certain moments in history, something new will emerge, like hip-hop emerged here in late 70s, early 80s.
And I thought the venue was really important here, too.
The venue,
yes.
To me, I thought the fact that they had it in such a cavernous space.
Absolutely.
And the way it was set up with these 11 huge screens with the band behind the screens and the lighting. I mean, the way it sort of enveloped, you used the word enveloped everybody. Mm-hmm. I thought it was terrific that the venue was perfect for this kind of event.
Well, and that's interesting because it sort of goes back to this idea of what's real and what's not real. If the band itself is behind the screen and we're watching the screen and the music is coming, it's like the man behind the curtain and what is real and what isn't, and we don't really sort of interact with them. We can't see them except through when the light changes or their image of their face is projected onto the screen. But I just wanted to jump back to something that you said, Simon, about how Massive Attack, there was nothing that we had ever heard like it before. And that in some ways stands in contrast to something that the piece talks about, which is about sort of the increasing data fetish that we have. You go on Amazon, oh, you bought this, you might like that, or you're on Twitter, you should follow this person because you follow that person, and nothing new is being created. But then that makes me wonder, you know, Massive Attack, you said in 1994, was like nothing we've ever heard before. And what does it mean that we're sitting here in 2013? And is it meant to reflect back on the immense creativity, or is it meant to sort of come back and be a part of that, if you like this, you might like that, sort of death of creativity? Or is that a death of creativity?
Who said that's death of creativity? Because you get a recommendation based on things you like in the past. I don't know, maybe that's advancement. You know, if I can say, look, I've read these kind of books, but here are 15 more you might, you know, my eyes are open, might read more things that are very interesting, that I find compelling. So I'm not sure, his technology data argument just didn't resonate with me. I mean, I got his case, I just didn't necessarily agree with it. You know, Twitter is a revolutionary form of communication. Twitter is giving us what's really happening on the breaking news. It's the breaking news platform. Twitter is revolutionizing the news business.
And revolutionizing journalism as well.
Journalism, I said, the news business, yes. And citizens now own breaking news. Well, who did you read about the Washington shooting from? You read it on Twitter first, from citizens who took pictures from inside the Capitol. And I'm not saying they're being replaced by journalists, but they're now part of this completely new ecosystem. So I don't know.
Joyce, I was just going to ask you, Joyce, I mean, as a journalist, you've got, in this piece, you've got an artist really invading journalistic space, and he's not invading it with the sort of detachment and the objectivity that a journalist normally brings to a story, but he's invading it with subjective, opinionated, angry and very combative material. Now, how does that make you feel as a journalist?
I just didn't see it as a work of journalism, so it didn't make me angry. I saw it as, I saw him as more of a documentary maker. He had a point, he found the clips, the people, the stories to tell to make a very strong point. Whether you agree with the point or not, you know, is another story. But I didn't take offense as a journalist. He didn't seem to be doing what we do in the best of our trade.
I was just going to say, I saw it less as an indictment of technology as a whole, and more of a sense of how are we using technology to retreat back into the sarcophagus, and how are we using it to sort of numb ourselves and just fall back into this spectator-like role where we just absorb and consume. And there's a clip, a very brief clip, and I'm not sure who the woman is, but she says, I go to bed and I check the news right before I go to bed so I know what happens, and then I wake up in the morning and I look at what I missed, and I'm just always watching. And I think part of the call at the end was this idea of find your own way home. Don't use Google Maps to find your way home, but this idea of like taking agency back. So I don't know that it was an indictment so much of just technology or Twitter or the news cycle, but the way that we've used it to just withdraw into ourselves. That's how I saw it.
Did you identify? Did you say that's me?
Yeah, I mean, I am a terrible addict of technology, and I'm on Twitter entirely too much, and I feel like our drive is to increase our productivity. Like, I'm in a sphere where I do some writing, and you have people like Matt Iglesias, who has changed the way that people write, and the idea is you're supposed to churn things out really quickly, and the death of the long read, like, we're all so distracted, and the more people run faster, the more we're all expected to run as fast as the rest of them. And we've sort of seen this death of doing things slowly and carefully and deliberately at the, you know, everyone wants to be the first one to report the headline. Right. And that leads sometimes to the headline being reported incorrectly.
I think the task of, to speak in very bold terms, the task of art is to slow down in that sense. You know, it's for me is what particularly theatre does, but or movies or music. It slows you. It's a kind of emergency brake. It's a kind of foot on the brake, and you can see what you're seeing at that point. You know, you arrest things for a second, for an hour or two, or whatever, how long it takes. And I think that's crucially important. I agree with you on this question of agency. We could talk more about this, but a question of technology. I think the relationship between technology and agency and technology and democracy, I think is just a complicated one. I think we get a very simple line here, which is because it, you know, what you said is absolutely true. We have this citizen journalism. We have incidents that, you know, I know Alexis was involved in things like Occupy, and I was down there as well, and that was something which was both, as it were, about bodies in space, about physical bodies in space, but also about mediation and technology at every particular instance. So the relationship between technology and democracy, I think, it's a complicated story.
It is.
As we've been sitting here, I've been talking about this, and we're sitting in New York, where I just had this vision of bringing the entire UN here to the Park Armory and playing this piece to the UN Security Council, and thinking what kind of impact and effect that would have on the people that are trying to run the world. It would be quite an interesting audience, because we're all, you know, probably of a certain cultural people and coming here for the art and so on, but the audience that he's really addressing isn't here.
Yeah, or some members of the US Congress, it would be good to...
Well,
Yeah,
Congress would be very interesting.
well, yeah.
If it functioned, if it were open.
What?
That's right.
Well, they're all there.
That's right.
They're all... Congress is
Could
open.
this kind of work have been written in the States? Is there the kind of interest and the kind of
I heard that
dynamism?
question asked by somebody who had left the room and was talking excitedly with the fellows that were, you know, discussing the show. They asked that exact question. I just happened to eavesdrop.
Well, would you like to try and answer it?
I don't know. I'm one of the Americans here. I don't know.
I mean, is the art scene here and the cultural scene here
Absolutely.
engaged enough to write a piece
Absolutely,
like this?
yeah. I mean, you know, it's a bit, I mean, I was reading Ben Ratcliffe's review in the Times, and he compares it to a kind of, this could be a kind of a similar undergraduate hit to Koyaanisqatsi, you know,
Yes.
or it could be, if you think about the documentary making of someone like Errol Morris, or there's a whole, it absolutely could happen here.
And I think that there's so much cynicism, especially among the millennials. And my friend Nicole Carty, who I work with at the other 98%, was recently talking about this. That she's 25, so she's come of age with 9/11, the financial crisis, crossing the $1 trillion mark in student debt, and these are people who sort of like 25% youth unemployment. And so I think that a lot of the art, especially coming out of the millennials, is very similar to what we see in the piece, this sort of deep cynicism about the sort of decades and decades of failure and this inability to really provide the basic services to help people live. And so, I agree with you that I do think, but I don't know, maybe it would probably come from perhaps a younger artist who has just lived through this past decade.
Well,
It would hard to be produced by a millennial. I think it had to be somebody who was living through that. Didn't you feel that way? It had to be somebody who was living through that period as an adult and absorbing it. I don't think somebody who didn't live in the Soviet era. I mean, my husband was teaching a journalism class and talking about the Gorbachev era, and is looking around, and you know, people are scratching their heads, and he says, you know, he has to define who Gorbachev is. So, you know, when you're at that stage, I don't think that a millennial could produce this. Something like it they could produce, and it may resonate, but I think this obviously has somebody who's connected personally with these histories. He picked people out that he connected with through this period and showed the distress.
I suppose I meant not this particular work, but a work of this
Yeah.
kind of genre and the work of that kind of political angle and power.
Yeah, I hadn't seen one here, but you know more than I do. But you've seen sort of bits and pieces of visual art and concerts with visual art, but it was sort of this interesting storytelling narrative combined with the concert and the screens and the technology that made it very exciting.
I mean, you know, there was a debate going on a little bit in the summer in the UK from one of our playwrights, Mark Ravenhill, who said the arts had somehow become disengaged from politics and current issues, and certainly I, for one, disagreed. In Edinburgh this summer, seeing every work I saw was about contemporary history in some way, most of it deeply depressing, about death, rape, bioethics, espionage. You know, they're now making a film about WikiLeaks. You know, so I sort of feel that arts are getting more engaged rather than less engaged.
The Occupy movement, there was a lot of art that came out of that, and I was at the MoMA with my mother and just so happened to see a bunch of newspapers that a number of my friends helped put together with beautiful graphics in it hanging up on the wall at the MoMA. This was probably a year ago at this point. But I do think that you certainly do see this reflected in art, maybe not in the more mainstream art, but certainly around the fringes.
And certainly I know colleagues from the British Council will know, certainly in parts of the Middle East where the social volatility and uncertainty, the arts are very much on the front line there in some of the countries, particularly Libya and Egypt.
Well, and I wonder if part of the message of the piece, and I don't know the answer to my own question, is that art allows you to escape the esophagus. Sorry, the esophagus. I don't know how Freudian slip that is. The sarcophagus.
That's very interesting.
We can analyze that later.
Well, it sort of allows, it's sort of, my question was, what's the future for arts activism here? I was directing that at you, so.
Well, yeah, I think that it's one of those mediums that corporatism really tries to control and engage in, and there's sort of this obsession with making something go viral and how do we make something catchy, and everyone was so disappointed. I don't know if folks used to follow that Twitter account, Horse eBooks, that would just tweet out random phrases, and people thought it was so hilarious, and apparently it's just all a part of some vast marketing scheme and everyone's hearts were broken. So there's this attempt to sort of like harness the arts in order to either maintain the status quo or sell you a widget, but it still seems to be, you were talking earlier about how Massive Attack just, and just the music out of Britain in general, just was your greatest export and just uncontrollably flows. And we were also talking about maybe we should bring up Pussy Riot and how quickly that story spread and the protests that they had in the church and the music itself. And so it does seem to be a mechanism for protest because it seems to be in some ways still this uncontrollable force that people respond to and then proliferate and spread.
I mean, British music for me, when I was 12 years old and I saw David Bowie on Top of the Pops performing Starman, in a sense, what happens in British music...
Giving away your age now, yeah?
No, I'm 53, so I was 12 years old, yeah. It was, that moment is, the people like Bowie, Syd Barrett, Nick Drake and others, there's a kind of, particular kind of British take on, which until that time had been hugely imitative of what was happening in the US. And also it becomes a kind of musical theatre. You know, in a sense, what people don't get about punk and post-punk and all those strange movements was their theatricality. So this is, the theatricality of this, in a sense, is very interesting in that regard. And it's a different kind of, a different picture of race emerges in the British context to the American context, because all these kids like Robert Del Naja are listening to is black American music or Jamaican reggae. Sure. And it produces a different kind of mongrel assemblage that is British music for those wonderful decades. And I mean, you know, I guess now Simon Cowell has tried to destroy, as Margaret Thatcher destroyed the institutions of the welfare state. Simon, what's his name? Yeah, has sort of single-handedly tried to destroy popular music as we.
I think he's got a lot of help. I don't know if it's just him.
He's got a lot of help.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he's the principal architect, isn't he?
For me, he's the principal architect. But
I mean, in this, I'm struck also by the fact that that's partly why I made the point about the playing it to the politicians in the UN. The politicians still have this amazingly ambivalent relationship to the arts in the sense that in one sense they're afraid of them, certainly in some parts of the world, and in other parts of the world, certainly in the UK, there's a sort of a sense that they're being not marginalized, but pushed into the box of a creative industry, so that they're there to provide economic growth and development.
Right.
And to some extent, that seems to me to militate against the arts as a vehicle for new thought, new ideas, inspiration, and the rest. It's something I have to wrestle with sort of every day at home in the job where, you know, dealing with government departments that are wanting to see return on investment. And I'm just wondering, this piece of work is, you know, that's never going to produce a return on investment. And yet it's a very powerful medium. And I'm just trying to rationalize those two extremes in terms of the political landscape in which this work inhabits. Do you have any comments on that?
One thing in particular, they go very hard against Goldman Sachs and the banks, and I happen to notice that the season, I'm sure I'll get in trouble for saying this, but the season of the Armory was sponsored by Citi, and I had to think to myself, is that because they went so hard against Goldman Sachs, or they just didn't watch the piece before they sponsored the entire season of the Armory?
Really?
Sort of this delicate, right? Because increasingly we have these corporations sponsoring the arts, and is that going to lead to censorship of the arts, or is...
Well, your entire arts ecology in the US is based on donations and philanthropy and corporate sponsorship anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm, again, the optimist on this panel probably, but, you know, there's a proliferation of nonprofits around this country and proliferation of artistic groups and theater groups and the like that you know, go to Indiegogo, and you can go and invest as an individual in projects that you want to invest in. So I see lots of alternatives, and you know, we live in this city that's oozing with this kind of stuff. I mean, I have my daughter's in the theater world, and she's constantly doing stuff on a shoestring, but it's getting out there, and people are, you know, it's a fabulously creative place. So I guess I'm not as down about this. And also, you know, if you go down the west side of our Riverside Park and look 10 years ago at what was there and what is there now, there are works of art almost every 100 feet. If you're a jogger, as I am, and you go down, it's an amazing jogging experience that you wouldn't have had 10 years ago. So I guess I think that there are exciting things that are happening too, that I don't see it as the corporatization necessarily of the arts. I think it's good that there is such a thing as corporate social responsibility, and that corporations are earmarking money for good causes. As a nonprofit, I run a nonprofit myself, and I take nothing if there are strings attached. And I will tell you that most of the people that give to us give with no strings attached.
I guess, I mean, I see more of a relationship between, certainly, I mean, popular culture, whatever we mean by that, let's say popular music, and periods of crisis, of decay, of chaos, you know, so the great periods, for example, of British punk is a very good example of something that comes out of a real sense of national crisis in Britain. Chancellor of the Exchequer going to the IMF to borrow money, and the shame involved in all of that. Bin bags in the street, trash in the streets, whatever. But it was also incredibly fecund, as indeed it was in New York in that period, right?
Yeah, it was.
The great period of, you know, musical fecundity in New York was a period of social catastrophe, right? And that's interesting. And I tend to think that, you know, and that's why, well, Massive Attack are from Bristol, right? And that's interesting. Bristol is not the capital city. Bristol's sort of to the side of that. And here I'm interested in, I think I place my bets more on the Detroits, the Baltimores, those places where things, in a sense, one of the problems with New York is that it's, I live in Brooklyn, and it's all a bit too, you know, you live a kind of parody that you can't escape. You know, you have facial hair, you become a parody. You don't have facial hair, you become a parody. You ride a bike, you're a parody. You don't ride a bike, you're a parody. You're a parody, you know, Brooklynite. And in a sense, we live this sort of intense self-consciousness all the time.
How many people in the audience live in Brooklyn then? Oh, practically all of you.
That's right. Stand up, Brooklyn. But it's all hell. It's a sarcophagus. No, it's not.
But Simon, it's interesting. The point you're making, in some ways, is that, you know, Bristol, Manchester, to some extent Liverpool, we were discussing that earlier, Birmingham certainly,
Leeds,
Gateshead, all these places in the UK have come back through the cultural lens, haven't they? They've all been reinvigorated through creative industries, through culture, through digital media, through new media, through experimentation. You say, I mean, is that the way forward in the States, where you've got these decaying industrial cities, and there doesn't seem any other way other than a creative return for those
Yeah, yeah. And I was in Cleveland a couple of years ago, and it was, Cleveland it was kind of fantastic because people are taking over disused blocks, doing urban farming, doing all sorts of extraordinary things. I went to 3 or 4 great record shops which had things you couldn't find here. There's a real sense of energy.
Rock and Roll
which
Hall
comes
of Fame.
Sorry?
Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So so I think, yeah. But it's, I worry about the way in which...
Pittsburgh, too, has done that.
Yeah.
Revived itself, become a cultural center. Used to be a steel town, and it's kind of redefined itself. Andy Warhol museums, Carnegie Mellon taking, creative energy oozing through the city. And so I think there are Detroits, and Detroit was... Motown, but...
I suppose what I'm angling at is, are we getting answers? You were saying, what does Adam Curtis say at the end? What's the way? Are we getting more energy now from city-states, as it were, than from state-states? And is this a way forward that is different from the one that's projected in the film?
It is, because I think that, perhaps in the past, and the film sort of starts with this, is the government tried to change the world, and the government tries to sort of affect programs, and they don't mention the Great Leap Forward, but there are all these examples of great, vast programs that were tried that led to mass devastation. And the sort of things that you're talking about, at least when I think about Detroit and the things that have been coming out of Detroit that are interesting and exciting and artistic, these are all people getting together on their own without support from companies, without support from the government, and if anything, they're being hampered by the emergency state that's been declared, and the pensions will be wiped out, and their whole city council democracy has been completely decimated by this emergency manager, but the people are acting autonomously without interference, or, well, not really interference, they're being interfered, but without help from the government. And in some ways, the piece, I don't know if that's the message of the piece, but it starts off with, here's when the government tried to help and it hurt us so terribly. And then there's this sort of call at the end that you should, rise up and have agency. And is the answer to that the government should try again and not be so scared of trying to change things? Because there's this big middle part where it's like, when we tried to change things, things went poorly. So we stopped trying to change things and we're just going to manage them and watch you. And there's this sort of invocation of the surveillance state. And so one thing that I'm not clear about is he sort of advocating this kind of anarchist/libertarian, let's just do it ourselves, kind of Occupy style? Or is it the government should realize that it's okay to make mistakes and we should try to change the world again instead of just being so scared? Or is it both? Is it neither? I don't know.
We'll never know because it wasn't developed in this presentation, I don't think.
Does anybody in the audience here have a question or point they want to make?
Just a thought on what Alexis, I think there's
think about it while Simon's making
there's a kind of reference back to a state-managed, a state-based politics that was about change. New Deal here, welfare state in Western Europe. Soviet communism is another example, and as it were, you could read it in a consistently kind of anarchistic way, in a sense that the emergence of this static world, this managed world, which has led to the sense in which the world is a kind of prison and what do we do, has also led to other kinds of possibilities. So where people in interstices, in gaps, do things for themselves, and we've seen that over the last few years in the name of Occupy and the rest. So you could read it that way, and I think it's...
and it sort of slightly fits in what you were saying earlier, Joyce, about the changes in journalism, and people are just taking control, aren't they? There's less...
Yeah, I think it's empowering.
It's empowering.
The technology can be scary and can be self-defeating, can also be very empowering. It just depends on how it's used. But in this case, yes. It is empowering.
So what future for News Corp and places and people like this, you're going to...
Are you asking about the future of journalism?
Yeah, well, I suppose so, yes.
How long have you got? That's right.
Well, I just think we're in the middle of the revolution now, and we don't exactly know who's going to survive, what's going to come out of it. But that said, I think all of us as citizens know that we need reliable, contextual, accurate information. We don't want to have to be trying to struggle to figure out whether something that comes across is accurate or not accurate. And so, so I think that there's going to be a combination of citizens putting their input into the system, and very valuably when it comes to breaking news. But also, you know, things can be doctored. You know, somebody could say this is breaking and it may not be breaking, so how do we verify and know this is real? So there's a lot of thought being given to how do we measure that? How do we figure that out with the technology? And also there's a need for skilled people who understand how to tell the story in a responsible way so that we as citizens can make good decisions because we have good information in our lives. And I think that's absolutely an essential part of any democracy. So I'm optimistic that journalism will survive. I'm not sure who will be telling those stories, who will be writing those pieces in the future, and what new streams of, you know, what new platforms will exist, and who all the players are, because it's much more complicated now.
Yeah.
Oh, good. I've got two. I was going to say something. So, lady at the back, and then there's another person nearly in the same row, and a gentleman in the front. Please.
I don't know if this is working.
Can't quite hear you at the moment.
No, is it turned on?
Try again. It's one of those mics, I think, that if you speak into it, it will speak up.
Hello? I don't know if it's on, but I'm sure you can all hear me.
There you go.
Okay, now it's on. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on something that was said earlier about, about, you know, the use of Twitter and how that affects media and et cetera. And I really related to what you were saying about it, and to, I guess, one of the things that for me is important about this work is that it asks questions about not whether information is available only, but about how much information there is to pay attention to, and being in this weird time when people's attention spans are increasingly diminished, and this kind of interaction of, you know, if we can even call it that, like this kind of media of, you know, using Twitter or using Facebook or whatever, these different means online, is also, it's coded like COATED with like corporate like typifications of people, and then that's then used to like kind of reify the more maybe organic ways in which social activity and creativity may have developed in the past. A lot of that kind of organic like flow has been taken away, where you do get, oh, if you like this story, look at this story, or maybe we'll just create that this type likes the story because we'll just put it there, you know? And so this kind of embeddedness and this kind of insidious getting into, you know, I mean, it's the big sort of thing about public and private, right? Like, how does that affect us?
Yeah, like we sort of, we withdraw into our own biases, and we surround ourselves with Twitter followers who agree with what we agree with, and we, you know, and if we don't, we're just talking to them to get into a fight. And so I've read, I feel like at least several news articles about this, about how our politics are increasingly polarized because the technologies that we use are creating these ways that we can live in these bubbles and not actually have to interact with people who don't agree with us, because if you like this, then you'll like this. If you follow this person on Twitter, find this other person who also agrees with you, and you can all have this either conservative bubble or liberal bubble or whatever bubble you might be living in. I'm not sure if that gets to what you were saying or not, but that was the first thing that sprung to my mind. And I liked what you said, too, about the reification, right? Like, it's almost as if, like, I don't know, Twitter in some ways I love and hate. Like, I'm on it a lot, and I feel like I can interact with people. Like, the barriers are down. Like, you know, sometimes you can talk to people you would never have access to, but it's also not really a natural experience, and you lose some of that human component of actually having a conversation with someone that may be a little bit boring at times, and you just push through it because that's what you do when you talk to somebody, and it doesn't have to be, everything doesn't have to be efficient. And so we start to like have our human interactions with people and expect it to behave by the same rules that the technology realm is, and so we're all just kind of like jerks, right? Like, we just wanted to be quick.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Is that good? Oh,
Good,
wow,
that's
that's
lovely.
too good. So I'm actually torn which question to ask, because I grew up in Bath and Bristol in the late 80s and early 90s, so I felt like there was like two conversations going on. There's like people who knew Bristol in the early 90s. But I also work in the media, so I'm kind of torn which route to go. I think I'm going to make a comment/question about the media. And it goes to what people were saying about the kind of the war for attention in the saturated landscape. And I think we spend a lot of time worrying about how we're being controlled by media. And there's great luminaries who's devoted their whole lives to worrying about it, Noam Chomsky and people like that, right? And when you see how content is actually manufactured on the shop floor, to me, you have a very different perspective, which is it's kind of just holding up a mirror to ourselves that everybody knows that if you engage the kind of fight or flight human reflex with your headline writing, you will get easy traction. And so that will always fly. And it will fly more and more in a highly saturated marketplace where you're trying to quote-unquote break through. So it's like, well, how do I break through? Well, no matter how, I've been in meetings where we've literally talked about, well, we've got this really smart intellectual piece, and we're just going to write some tabloidy gotcha headline because we're not going to get our numbers. And so I think we should stop worrying about the evil others trying to control our consciousness and start thinking about what we click on or choose to read. I think it's, I'm going to sound like a bad, I don't know, Republican congressman now saying it's all about personal responsibility. But that's not my intention. But there is an element of, a lot of this is holding a mirror to ourselves in terms of what the content that we choose to engage in. And a lot of the control mechanisms that people see as control mechanisms are actually very willing. Everyone's a very willing participant in the control mechanism, and you have to choose not to participate if you wish to no longer participate. And that takes hard work, and our lives are so comfortable we can't be bothered to do the hard work, I think.
There's one thing
Well, everybody wants to come back at you on that. Okay, thanks.
If you haven't heard of him, there's a man named Moxie Marlinspike, and he wrote a response to the NSA leaks that was basically why, if you're not doing anything wrong, you shouldn't worry is the wrong way to think about surveillance. And it speaks to this idea that we're all making these choices and we should just stop making these choices. And he has this really great lecture that he gave called Gmail is Not a Choice. And his basic point is we could all choose not to have a cell phone, but society, there's something called the no network problem. Whereas if you're not using something that has a network of people that are also using it, you're all by yourself. And so using a cell phone is no longer about whether or not you want to carry it around, but whether or not you want to participate in society, because society has changed the way it behaves. Because we used to make a plan to meet at a certain day at a certain time, and we would stick to it. And now we all have phones, and so we can change it at any time. And it's just like, oh, I'll call you after work. And so I hear what you're saying about not clicking on the side boob link or whatever, but I don't think that it's as simple as that when it comes to something like whether or not you use Gmail or whether or not you use Twitter, because even if you don't use Gmail and you use Rise Up and you make that personal choice, you cannot talk to anyone else that uses Gmail. And so I think that we do have agency in some sense about what headlines we click on and whether we read those meaty stories, but then there are other places where society has moved on and we...
I think, yeah. Okay. I think that we have a real crisis because the metrics used to value the good journalism skew us more towards the tabloidy headlines and the tabloidy stories. I know for a fact that I used to work for a business news magazine, and we had somebody who would do slideshows all the time online, and feature how to renovate your bathroom. And this was not a franchise that this business magazine was doing. But when they put it up, Yahoo would pick it up, sort of a Martha Stewart type thing, and it'd get 5 million hits, and it encourages you to go into this very different direction that's not the core of what you're all about. And I think that that's been, hits, the way we measure success or the way advertisers force the news business to measure success is problematic. And I do believe it's going to change. Because I do believe that people want, you know, that you can value a smaller audience who wants to get this stuff and doesn't want to read and click on the Martha Stewart toilet story. But they are smart, they are people that you may want to be advertising in front of, and it may not be a million clicks. So now I've just seen technology where now you can see how far somebody's read into a story. And that might be a measure of, well, you know, are you going to, you know, 10, 7, 8 paragraphs into the story and really, really looking at it? You know, I'm not saying that that's a perfect solution, but I'm just saying that I think the advertising environment's so confused now, and I don't think they've quite gotten it. And that's why the business model for journalism is so incredibly broken. But I'm
Yes, because, I mean, social media is doing the job that advertising used to do, essentially now, isn't it?
Well, yeah, to some degree it is, or they're advertising on social media instead of in the New York Times or the New Yorker.